They say, in the city of mist, where every breath carries the scent of pine and memory, there are names that must never be spoken and graves that must never be remembered. If you ever wander near the lake they call Thentho, when the fog begins to curl low like sleeping ghosts and a faint wind stirs the scent of old incense, do not light a stick. Do not kneel. Do not whisper your wish to anything that does not answer, because once the name is heard in that place, it will not stop listening to you. Local people don't speak much about the graveyard beyond the hill. It's not the official cemetery, not the one marked on tourist maps. This one hides behind a curtain of fog, a few hundred meters from the road leading down to the lake's edge. Old crosses, cracked stone tablets, nameless mounds covered in creeping grass. Some say they belong to lovers who drowned themselves in the lake. Others say they are unclaimed bodies, buried by strangers, lost to time. But one thing is certain, there is a single grave with no name, no date, no flower. Only a single stone, blackened by rain and time, and a faint circle of ash. And it is said, if anyone dares to light incense there, the smoke will burn backward, curling down instead of rising, like something unseen is breathing it in. He was a photographer, quiet, solitary, with the look of a man who'd seen too many dawns through a lens. His name was Min, though the story rarely mentions it. They say he arrived in Dalat on a cold morning in November, chasing the light of the mist. He had always loved the way fog wrapped around the pines, how it made the world disappear and return, second by second, like the breath of some ancient god. He believed photographs could trap that kind of silence, the in-between of waking and dreaming. He stayed at a small guest house near the lake, run by an old woman who warned him not to wander too far after dusk. There are things, she said, her voice half whisper, half prayer, that the mist remembers better than we do. He smiled, thinking it was only superstition. But that night, when the city fell quiet and the fog rolled in thick as milk, he couldn't sleep. He took his camera, his tripod, and followed the road down to the lake. The same road that locals avoid when the wind turns cold. The graveyard was not marked. He found it by accident, or perhaps it found him. He had stopped to photograph a patch of mist glowing silver under a lamppost when he saw the faint outlines of stone beyond the trees. Curiosity, the curse of every artist, drew him in. The air felt heavier there, as if breathing meant disturbing something old. Every step crunched against soil that sounded too hollow. He found the graves, the crosses, the moss-covered names. And then, that stone, the one with no inscription, no offering, only the circle of ash. He hesitated. There was something strange about the air. Like a whisper he could almost hear, calling just behind him, soft and feminine. But when he turned, there was only fog. He looked at the ground again, and the ash circles seemed fresh, as if someone had just burned incense there. He felt a pull, not fear, but a strange compassion, the same kind that drives photographers to capture lonely places. He took a single stick of incense from his bag, something he always carried for luck, a habit from his grandmother. He lit it. The flame flickered. The smoke rose. Then suddenly it bent downward. He froze. The smoke, instead of drifting up, curled and sank into the soil, like water drawn through cracks. The scent was wrong, sharp, bitter, like wet iron. Still, he whispered, a simple, harmless wish. For good fortune, for beauty. And somewhere beneath the ground, something heard. When he returned to his room, his camera bag felt heavier than before. He thought it was only the damp air. He showered, wiped the mist from his mirror, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow standing behind him. but the fog outside was so thick it swallowed everything. The next morning, he developed his photos in the dim light of the guest house. Each shot was a masterpiece. The pine trees veiled in mist, the lake rippling like glass, the early sun breaking through cloud. But then, in the corner of one frame, he saw it. A figure, faint, blurred, half hidden by fog. A woman standing just behind him. Her face was not clear, but her outline was unmistakable. She was facing him, and the incense smoke, curling backward, hung between them like a thin gray thread. He checked the other frames, and in every one, she was closer. Sometimes behind a tree, sometimes standing by the water, sometimes only a reflection in the lens, but always there, always watching. That night, the old woman from the guest house knocked on his door. Her eyes were red, her face pale. "You lit incense, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, and that was enough of an answer. She told him that long ago, before the lake became a lover's legend, there was a woman who waited by that hill for her fiancé to return from war. He never did. She waited until the cold took her voice, then her breath, and finally her name. Her grave was buried without a mark, because no one knew who she was. They say she lingers still, searching for the one who would remember her. And anyone who lights incense at her grave calls her name, even without speaking it. Outside, the fog thickened, and through the thin curtains, he could see a faint glow, as if someone was walking up the hill, carrying a single burning stick of incense. But the smoke wasn't rising. It was falling slowly, curling down toward the ground, like something breathing from below. By the second dawn, the fog had thickened so much that even sound seemed to lose its way. The morning bells from the church across the lake came muffled and hollow, like echoes from underwater. Min sat by the window, his camera laid out before him, a line of damp negatives drying in the pale light. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her shape. Faint, distant, wrapped in smoke. The woman in the frame. He told himself it was just a trick of exposure. Fog can do that. Twist light, blur shadows, breathe life into air. But then, he noticed something else. In the last photo he took, the incense flame was still visible, just a spark against the gray. And in the frame after that, the flame was gone, but the smoke was there. Not rising, not falling, but coiling, like fingers. He leaned closer. The smoke had formed a shape, a curve, a hollow, the faintest suggestion of an eye. And within that hollow was his reflection. He packed his gear and went out again, trying to convince himself it was just a photograph, a fault of film. The morning was cold, the mist hanging low over the lake like white breath. Even the pine trees seemed to bow, their tips sinking into fog. As he reached the same slope, a strange quiet fell over the air. Not silence, but listening. Every sound, his breath, his steps, the click of the camera's latch, seemed too loud, too real, like something out there was holding its breath with him. He set up his tripod by the same grave. The ash circle was still there, though the wind should have scattered it by now, and beside it lay the incense stick he had lit the night before. It was still burning, just a red ember, faint and trembling. But it was there. He stepped back, cold creeping up his spine. The stick was nearly spent, and yet it had burned all night without turning to ash. He didn't take a photo this time. Instead, he turned to leave, but the fog thickened suddenly, folding in around him, and from behind, through the mist, came the sound of footsteps, soft, bare, following. He stopped. The steps stopped. He took one more step forward, and the sound followed, one heartbeat late. He turned, camera raised, flash ready. Nothing. only fog and stone. He stood still, trembling, the shutter button cold under his finger. Then, click. He pressed it without thinking. The flash burst white. For half a second, the world was light, and in that instant, he saw her. Not far, perhaps 2 meters behind him, a woman in a white owl dye, soaked and torn at the hem, hair hanging like wet silk, her head tilted slightly, her eyes closed. But her mouth was moving, as if she was whispering his name. And then, the light was gone. He ran, through the mist, down the road, until the houses came back into view. When he reached the guest house, his breath tore through his chest, his fingers numb with cold. The old woman was waiting at the door, holding a candle. "You shouldn't have gone back," she said, voice trembling. Her eyes darted to his camera. "She follows through the lens." Min said nothing. He just went to his room, shut the door, and sat with the camera in his lap. The faint scent of incense clung to the metal, sharp and sweet, and wrong. When he finally dared to look, he turned the camera on and scrolled through the shots. The first few were fog, trees, stones. But the last was taken when he pressed the shutter. And it wasn't just a blur of white, it was her. Standing there, arms at her sides, eyes half open. And behind her, the fog wasn't white anymore. It was dark, dense, like smoke curling from 1,000 unseen fires. And on the ground beside her bare feet lay a burnt incense stick. Its smoke drifted backward into the soil. He stayed in his room for the rest of the day. He didn't eat, didn't move, didn't answer when the old woman called. Outside, the fog pressed against the window glass, and sometimes, just before dusk, he thought he saw a shadow standing beyond it, watching. When night came, he dreamed. He was back at the lake. The mist was thicker, the water black and still. He heard a voice, soft and slow, like a lullaby sung through teeth. It called his name, Min, Ming. And when he turned, she was standing on the water. Her eyes opened this time. They were hollow, as if something had scooped the light out from behind them. And she said, "You remembered me." Then she smiled. He woke to the sound of something tapping on glass. Rhythmic, measured. He sat up. The room was still, the candle burnt to wax. Tap, tap, tap. The window. He turned slowly. A pale hand rested against the glass, fingers long and thin, each one trembling slightly. Behind the hand, fog. And inside the fog, a face. Her. The same face from the photo. Wet, cold, patient. He froze, unable to scream, unable to breathe. The hand slid down the glass, leaving streaks of condensation. Then, as quietly as it came, it vanished. The next morning, he decided to leave Dalat. But when he stepped outside, his camera bag was already packed, as if someone had touched it. The old woman stood by the door, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Take this," she said. Inside was a small mirror, old and blackened around the edges. "Keep it covered. Do not let her see herself again." He didn't understand, but he took it. As he turned to go, she whispered, "She only returns when someone remembers. You prayed for beauty, and she was once the most beautiful thing in this town." That night on the bus leaving Dalat, he opened his camera one last time. He deleted the photos one by one, until only one remained. The first one, the one before he lit the incense. But when he looked closer, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. In the corner, faint and gray, was a figure, not of her, but of himself, and behind him, a shadow of another head, leaning close, as if whispering into his ear. The bus wound down the mountain road in silence, headlights slicing through curtains of fog that refused to part. Min sat by the window, his camera on his lap, his fingers tracing the cold metal frame. Every turn of the wheel seemed to pull him further from the mist, and yet it clung to him like a breath that refused to end. He told himself that distance would break the spell, that once he left the lake behind, the ghost would fade like smoke in the morning. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet dread whispered otherwise. As the bus passed the final bend overlooking Hotan Tho, he looked out and saw the lake one last time, still as glass beneath the fog. And there, just at the edge of sight, stood a figure in white, small, still, unshaken by the wind. He blinked, and she was gone. Only the mist remained, waving like a pale hand in farewell. He reached Saigon before dawn. The city was heavy with humidity and light, a living thing compared to the silence of the mountains. Yet even among the noise, he felt watched. He checked into a hotel downtown, drew the curtains tight, and set his camera on the desk. When he turned on the light, he noticed the incense stick. It was inside his camera bag, snapped in half, the tip blackened. He hadn't packed it. The scent rose before he could react. Sweet, sharp, clinging to his throat. He rushed to the sink and poured water over it. The smoke hissed, then bent, downward, always downward. He tried to work. Photography was all he knew. But every photo he developed carried the same stain. A figure faint somewhere behind him. Sometimes she was in the reflection of a window, sometimes in the sheen of a puddle. Once, she stood among a crowd of strangers, and no one else seemed to notice. Her presence followed the camera, not him, but the lens, as if the act of seeing had become a kind of summoning. He stopped shooting after that, but the dreams didn't stop. Every night he saw her, closer each time, her face more visible, her eyes wet with something that wasn't sorrow. In the dreams, she whispered things he couldn't remember upon waking. Only one phrase lingered, echoing like a prayer. "You called me beautiful." One evening, he visited a photography shop to sell his gear. The man behind the counter, old and kind, handled the camera with care. He looked through the viewfinder, adjusted the lens, and frowned. "There's something strange here," he said, turning the focus ring. "It's like it doesn't want to look away." Min asked what he meant. The man stepped back, his face pale. "The glass," he said quietly. "It's burning." Min looked. The lens was fogging over from the inside, a dark mist swirling behind the glass. And then, right before his eyes, a faint line of smoke curled up from the camera body. It didn't rise. It sank, thin and steady, into the countertop. He grabbed the camera and ran. Behind him, the shopkeeper shouted something, a prayer, a warning, but his voice was drowned out by the hum of the city. That night in his room, he laid the camera on the table and stared at it. The mirror the old woman had given him was still wrapped in cloth, resting nearby. He remembered her words. Do not let her see herself again. But the lens was a mirror, and maybe, he thought, she wanted to see. He unwrapped the small mirror, hands trembling. The glass was dark, cloudy, like old water. He held it next to the lens, slowly aligning them. At first, nothing happened. Then the air shifted. A low hum, like wind trapped in a cave. The candle on the desk flickered, though there was no breeze. And then, smoke, black, thin, curling from the camera's aperture. It reached out, winding toward the mirror like a searching hand. He tried to pull away, but the air pressed down heavy, thick, like underwater. And then he saw her, not behind the lens, not in reflection, but in the room. Her white owl dye clung to her like mist. Her hair dripped onto the floor. Her feet left no trace. She moved closer, one step, then another, the faint scent of incense blooming in the air. Her eyes lifted, And for the first time, he saw them clearly, not hollow anymore, alive, filled with something that might once have been love or hunger. She reached toward the mirror, her fingers passing through the smoke. The reflection trembled, and for a brief second, he saw two versions of her, one pale and distant, the other dark and burned, her skin cracked like charred wood. The room shook. The candle died. The mirror fell, shattering against the floor, and the sound it made was not of glass breaking, but of something exhaling, a long, heavy breath that smelled of ash and rain. When he woke, the room was cold. The mirror was gone. In its place on the table lay his camera, and beneath it a single photograph. It was new. He hadn't taken it. In it, he sat at the same table, head bowed, the candle burning low beside him. And behind him stood the woman, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her face turned toward the lens, her eyes black as the lake at midnight. At the bottom of the photo, written in faint gray ink, were three words: "Remember me, beautiful." He left the city the next day. No one saw him board the train. Some say he never did. But weeks later, guests at a small inn in Dalat claimed they heard a camera click near the lake. Soft, deliberate, as if someone was still taking pictures in the fog. And sometimes when the mist is thick enough, you can see a figure standing by the grave. A man with a camera and a woman behind him, their faces turned toward the lens. No one noticed his absence at first. In cities like Saigon, people vanish into noise every day, swallowed by the hum of traffic, the static of rain on glass. The world forgets quickly, but a month later, when the owner of the photography shop found a small parcel left on his doorstep, wrapped in brown paper, marked only with a faint scent of incense, whispers began to return. Inside the parcel was a roll of undeveloped film, and on the tag, written in trembling ink, was a single line: "For those who still remember her." The man brought it to a journalist he knew, a woman named Lan, who had once written about the folklore of Dalat. She was known for her calm voice and careful words, and she didn't believe in ghosts, at least not entirely. But when she unwrapped the film, a thin line of ash fell out, coating her fingertips. She looked at the old photographer. He looked back, pale, and neither spoke for a long while. Lan traveled to Dalat soon after, the roll of film sealed in a lead canister, as though keeping something from breathing. The city greeted her with the same cold breath Min had once felt. Mist spilling over rooftops, the smell of pine heavy with rain. The locals warned her not to go near Hotantho at dusk. Some said a woman still walked the lake's edge, weeping for someone who had taken her photograph. Lan smiled politely, as journalists do, but she carried a rosary in her pocket, and each night she found herself waking at the same hour, 3:17, to the faint sound of water dripping in the sink. On her third morning, she went to the graveyard. It wasn't easy to find. The fog seemed to twist the roads, leading her in circles until she saw it, a cluster of crosses beyond a fence of rusted wire. She stepped through. Every step sank into soft soil. The graves were old, broken, forgotten. And in the middle stood the one without a name. The air around it was colder. Her breath turned white. And though no wind stirred, she smelled incense, faint but unmistakable. She knelt, camera in hand, and took a single photograph. The sound of the shutter echoed too long, like a sigh that didn't want to end. When she looked up again, there was something new, the circle of ash around the grave, fresh, perfect, unbroken. She stepped back, heart pounding. Something told her to leave, but another voice, softer inside her, whispered, "Just one more picture." She raised the camera. The light flickered. The lens fogged. Through the viewfinder, the world blurred, then cleared, and she saw her. A woman in white standing by the lake's edge, her back turned, hair falling like a black curtain. Lan blinked, and the woman turned. Her face was calm, almost kind, but her eyes were hollow like mirrors filled with smoke. The camera clicked on its own. The woman smiled, and then she was gone. Lan returned to her room that night and locked the door. She sat at her desk, staring at the undeveloped film. It felt warm in her hand, almost alive. When she finally loaded it into the tank, she noticed her reflection in the metal sink. Her face looked pale, her lips slightly blue, and behind her reflection was another face, a woman's, eyes open, watching. Lan dropped the tank, chemicals spilling across the floor. The light flickered once, twice, then went out. In the darkness, the smell of incense thickened until she could hardly breathe. She stumbled to the switch, but the air pressed heavy, and somewhere behind her, water began to drip again. Drip, drip, drip. She turned. The sink was dry, but on the floor the spilled chemicals had gathered in a dark puddle, and in it, the reflection of a woman in white. Lan ran. The negatives were found 3 days later by a maid cleaning the room. The journalist had vanished. The window was open, though the room was on the 3rd floor. On the desk, beside the drying rack, were 12 developed photos. All missed, all the same angle, facing the nameless grave. But the last one was different. The fog had parted just enough to reveal 2 figures, a man with a camera and a woman behind him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. The man's face was empty, blurred by motion, but the woman's was clear, and her eyes looked straight at whoever dared to look back. Months later, a fisherman found something caught in his net near the lake, an old camera covered in silt and pine needles. The film inside was ruined, except for one frame. It showed the lake itself, calm, black, mirror still. But beneath the surface, faint and ghostly, was the outline of a face, not floating, not drowning, just waiting. And if you looked long enough, you could see that the face was smiling. They buried the camera at the edge of the lake, beside the nameless grave. A priest blessed the ground, and for a time, the fog seemed lighter, the air less cold. But only for a time, because some nights when the mist grows too thick and the pine trees whisper in the wind, people say they can still see her reflection on the water, pale, serene, eyes wide open, as if watching herself from beneath the surface. And sometimes in the stillness, a faint click breaks the silence, the sound of a shutter closing, of memory sealing itself in silver and shadow. They call it the curse of the backward incense. Light it wrong, whisper a wish you shouldn't, and the one who was forgotten will rise to answer it. Not in flesh, but in image. Not in love, but in remembrance. And once she is remembered, she cannot return to the dark. Even now, locals say that near the lake, if you light incense and watch closely, the smoke will not rise. It will sink, curling into the earth as though feeding something that still hungers. And if, in the fog, you see a woman in white standing by the shore, don't raise your camera, because she will always smile for the picture. That night, the fog returned thicker than before, swallowing every tree, every path, every whisper of the wind. It was as if the entire forest had been soaked in silence, and even the crickets refused to sing. He locked himself in his room, his camera resting on the desk, facing him like an unblinking eye. He had not dared to look at the photographs for days, but tonight he could not resist. He turned on his desk lamp, a dim orange bulb that trembled faintly, as if afraid of what it might reveal. The soft glow spilled over the table, over the stack of photographs that lay in disorder. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the top print. The image showed the cemetery at dawn, the lake behind it veiled by mist. It was a shot he had taken on the first morning, the day he whispered that fateful wish. But as he stared at the photo, something shifted. The fog in the picture seemed to move. He blinked. The air in his room turned colder. His breath fogged before him. He leaned closer, and then he saw it. A faint silhouette in the background, behind the gravestone. A woman standing still, her head tilted slightly to one side. Her hair was long, hanging like wet threads over her face. She had not been there before. He dropped the photograph. It slid across the desk, falling to the floor with a soft hiss. He reached for another one. In every photograph, she was closer, behind him in one, beside him in the next. Sometimes her reflection appeared faintly on the surface of the lake, sometimes behind the trees, sometimes among the graves, but always there, watching, waiting. He tore through the stack, his heart beat loud in his ears. Every shot he had taken since that morning was tainted by her presence. Even when he photographed other places, the market, the pine hills, the streets of Dalat, her outline lingered somewhere in the fog. And then he saw the last photo. It was one he didn't remember taking, a photo of his own window from the outside. The same dim orange light, the same curtain half drawn, and in the reflection of the glass, his own figure sitting at the desk, and behind him, that woman. Her hand rested on his shoulder. The bulb above him flickered. He turned. Nothing. Only the soft hum of the night. Only the smell, faint but distinct, of burning incense. But on his desk, the incense stick he had left cold and unused was now glowing at his tip, burning backward. The smoke curled upward, twisting like a finger, like a whisper that could not speak. He couldn't breathe. Something pressed against his back. Not a hand, not quite a shadow, but the weight of someone who should not be there. He could hear the faintest sigh, right beside his ear. The kind that sounds like your name being exhaled by the wind. He bolted from the room, the door slamming behind him. He didn't stop until he reached the main road, under the weak yellow streetlights, panting, heart clawing at his chest. The night in Dalat was colder than he had ever felt. And yet beneath the chill, he could still sense warmth, the lingering warmth of another presence, one step behind him. When he looked down at the camera still hanging from his neck, the screen had turned on by itself. There was a single photo displayed. He was standing there, on the same road, under the same streetlight, and behind him, she was smiling. For 3 nights after that, Hui didn't sleep. The photographs lay scattered across the floor, their surfaces catching the faint light from the window. And whenever the wind moved, they rustled, like the soft shuffle of bare feet across the floorboards. He tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, that his mind was merely a camera, overexposed by grief and guilt. But then the voice began. It started quietly, a breath against his ear as he closed his eyes. Then a whisper, faint and fragile, as if carried from a distance through the fog. At first, he couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, a murmur rising and falling, like the sound of a prayer. But every night it grew clearer. Sometimes it called his name. Sometimes it repeated the same phrase again and again, a phrase that made the air freeze in his lungs. "You remembered me, didn't you?" Each syllable stretched like silk torn slowly apart. Hui would jolt awake, sweat soaking through his clothes, his breath heavy. He would look around, but there would be no one. Only the thick mist seeping through the window gaps, curling along the floor. He moved out of the guest house after the third night, taking a small room on the edge of town, closer to the pine forest. But the voice followed him. It hid in the wind, in the slow creak of the floor, in the sound of the shutters tapping lightly against the wall. Everywhere he went, he caught glimpses of her, in reflections, in puddles, in the mirrored glass of coffee shops. Sometimes when he raised the camera to his eye out of habit, he would see her before he pressed the shutter. Standing at a distance, veiled in fog, her posture motionless, her hair drifting slightly as though underwater. Locals began to notice the change in him. The cafe owner where he used to sit at dawn whispered to a friend that Hui no longer spoke. He sat there for hours, camera untouched, staring toward the road that led to the cemetery. One evening, the woman who ran the inn knocked on his door. She told him, in a voice barely above a murmur, that it was not wise to stay near the lake after sundown. "There's a grave there," she said. "No name, no offerings. The monks warned long ago that it must remain untouched. But sometimes, travelers light incense without knowing." And then, her words drifted off. Hai listened, pale and silent. He wanted to tell her he was that traveler, but his throat refused to move, because the air in the room had turned cold again, because he could see, over her shoulder, the faint line of smoke rising from an incense stick in the corner, even though no one had lit it. He ran before she could finish her sentence. That night he went back to the cemetery. The fog was so thick it felt solid, like stepping into another world. The graves loomed like dark islands, and the lake beside them was still as glass. Not even the moon could find its way through the clouds. He walked until he reached the nameless grave, and there, someone had placed a single incense stick. It burned in reverse, red at the base, smoke sinking instead of rising. The smell was not the scent of sandalwood. It was old, metallic, like something decaying beneath wet soil. He whispered, a trembling sound that wasn't quite prayer, not quite apology. "I didn't mean to call you." But the wind rose, and through it came the voice again, closer now, clearer than ever before. "You remembered me, didn't you?" He turned, and for the first time he saw her face. It was not monstrous, not even frightening. It was simply wrong. A face too pale to belong to the living, eyes too black to reflect the world. Her lips trembled as though struggling to shape a memory. And when she smiled, Hui felt every muscle in his body turn to stone. Because her smile was not for him, it was a response. As if she had heard a question he had forgotten he asked. The fog surged. The world dimmed, and before he could run, the camera in his hand clicked by itself. The flash cut through the mist, and when it faded, the grave was empty. Only the incense remained, still burning backward. The next morning came without dawn. The sky above Dalat hung low, a bruised gray without light, as if the sun itself refused to look upon what had been called back. The fog no longer drifted gently. It clung, heavy and damp, pressing against the skin, crawling through the cracks of doors and lungs alike. Hui awoke to the sound of a knock, 3 times, slow, hollow. He waited, but no one spoke. When he opened the door, only a folded piece of paper lay on the ground, weighed down by a stone, still wet with dew. Inside was an old photograph, faded, sepia-toned. It showed the same cemetery near Ho Tan Tho, though decades older. The trees were smaller, the lake darker, and standing before the nameless grave was a woman. Her face was blurred by time, but her posture, her hair, her presence unmistakable. Behind her, a man held a camera. Hui felt the air leave his lungs. He turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back, in trembling handwriting, were two words. No toy. Remember me. He stared at the words until his eyes burned. Then from somewhere deep in memory, a sound returned. The low, brittle hum of a prayer whispered at dawn. His own voice, his own wish. If there's any spirit here, bring me luck, let me be remembered. He had said it so lightly then, a small, thoughtless offering to the wind. But someone had heard him, someone who had been forgotten for too long. He left his room and walked toward the old quarter of town. The locals said there was a small library, half museum, half archive, that kept records of Dalat's early settlers. The librarian, an old man with trembling hands and cataract-clouded eyes, looked up as Hui entered. I'm looking for information, Hui said quietly, about a grave, near Ho Than Tho, no name. The old man hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. Why do you want to know about her? Hui froze. She? The old man sighed, his voice barely audible. They say she was a young woman, a photographer's lover before the war. He went missing one winter, and she waited for him by the lake. They found her body weeks later, or what was left of it. But her family, no one came to claim her. So they buried her there. The grave was never named. He paused, the weight of the story sinking into the silence. People used to leave incense for her, but one day a monk sealed the place, said her spirit had grown restless, that too many had called her name in pity, and so the grave was left alone. No offerings, no prayers, no remembrance. The librarian's eyes drifted toward the fog window. But every few years, someone forgets. Someone lights a stick of incense or whispers a wish. And then, for a time, she returns. Hui's mouth was dry. He wanted to speak, but the sound that left his throat was barely human. I didn't mean to. The man nodded slowly. No one ever does. Outside, the air had turned colder. The mist swirled, carrying with it that scent again. Faint incense, but reversed, as though memory itself was burning backward. Hui looked down at the photograph in his hand. For a moment, he could swear the woman in the image had shifted. Her head tilted slightly, her gaze meeting his through the years. And from somewhere, the reflection of a glass door, a window pane, or the surface of his own camera lens, her voice returned, tender, trembling, sorrowful. You remembered me, didn't you? He stumbled back, the photograph slipping from his grasp. It fluttered into the puddle by his feet, ink bleeding, her face dissolving into water. But before it vanished completely, another word surfaced faintly beneath the blur, almost carved into the paper by pressure long ago. Lin. A name, soft as breath, sharp as loss. And with that name, something inside him broke. A realization that memory, once awakened, could never be buried again. He lifted his eyes. The street was empty, but the fog ahead seemed to move with purpose, curling, shaping itself into the outline of a figure walking away, toward the lake. And though every instinct screamed for him to turn back, he followed. Because some promises, even those whispered by mistake, must be fulfilled. The mist was not just a veil that night. It was alive. It breathed. It pulsed. It whispered his name through the spaces between the trees, as though the forest itself had become her voice. Hui walked, each step sinking deeper into the cold. The trail that led toward Ho Than Tho had long since vanished under the fog, but he did not need to see. Something inside him, something beyond fear, beyond reason, was pulling him forward. The lake awaited him, still as a sheet of black glass. No sound, no wind. Only the faint reflection of the cemetery lights in the distance, flickering as though drowning under the water's surface. And then he saw her, standing by the nameless grave, the same posture, the same long, wet hair clinging to her face. But this time, she was not shrouded by distance. The mist parted for her like breath before a prayer. Her dress was the pale color of old film, once white, now stained by years of earth and memory. Her eyes were dark hollows that shimmered faintly, like something remembering how to see. Hui stopped a few steps away. The camera hung heavy around his neck, the lens fogged by his breath. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to ask for forgiveness. But his voice failed him, and still she smiled. It was not cruel, not vengeful. It was the kind of smile one gives to someone they once loved before everything was taken. Slowly she raised her hand. In her fingers, an incense stick burned. Backward. The ember moved down toward her hand, the ash falling not to the earth, but upward, drifting toward the night sky like lost souls escaping the body. The smoke touched Hui's skin. It was cold as shadow, yet it sank into him, threading through his veins. He gasped, his knees weakening. Memories that weren't his began to flicker behind his eyes. A man holding a camera by this very lake. A woman laughing softly, her reflection shimmering beside him. The promise of return whispered under the breath of twilight. Then the waiting, the silence, the unmarked grave. The truth struck him like lightning through fog. He was not the first. He was only the next. The spirit, Lin, had waited for someone to remember her, not with words but with the lens. The act of seeing had called her back. His photograph was her resurrection, his prayer the thread that tied her once more to this world. And now the thread must be cut. He stepped closer, trembling. "What do you want from me?" Her lips moved, but no sound came. Only a wisp of smoke curling into the air, forming words that did not belong to the living. "Finish the frame." The camera in his hands powered on by itself. The shutter clicked once, a sound that cracked through the silence like a nail into wood. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Then she began to fade. The mist dissolved around her, her outline unraveling like a film reel burning at its edge. Her eyes lingered the longest, two small mirrors that held the reflection of his face, before vanishing completely into the smoke. Only the grave remained, and the scent of incense still burning in reverse. Hui fell to his knees. The camera slipped from his grasp, landing gently on the grass. Its screen glowed faintly. A new photo had appeared. It showed the grave, but no spirit, no fog. Only him, kneeling before it, his hands clasped, his face bowed low, as though captured by someone else's lens. And then, the light dimmed. The screen went black. When the locals found the camera by the grave the next morning, the fog had already lifted. The grave was bare. No flowers, no footprints, no incense. The photographs inside the camera were blank, except for one. The last frame. A man kneeling before an empty grave. And behind him, a faint, pale hand resting on his shoulder. No one ever found Hui again. But some mornings when the mist rolls heavy across Hotantho, the fishermen claim they see a man standing near the cemetery, camera in hand, waiting for the perfect light. And when the wind blows against the water, it carries with it a single whisper, soft, fragile, almost a prayer. "You remembered me, didn't you?"